What if I told you that a single parole decision made in 1983 would lead to the murder of an innocent teenager 2 years later? And that the technology to solve her murder existed for decades, but the killer's identity remained hidden because of that very same 1983 decision? This is the story of 15-year-old Christy Wesselman, murdered in Glen Ellen, Illinois in 1985. Her case went cold for 33 years, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because the system failed in the most devastating way possible. I'm going to take you through one of the most complex cold cases in American criminal history. This case became the most notorious in DuPage County history, generating a $10,000 reward and changing the entire landscape of criminal justice, DNA databases, and victim rights in America. This isn't just about a killer who evaded justice for 3 decades. It's about how the failures of indeterminate sentencing, the evolution of forensic science, and the convergence of technology, law, and pure chance can either destroy innocent lives or deliver long-awaited justice. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a case from 1985 transformed American criminal justice forever. But first, let me tell you about a perfect summer day that turned into a family's worst nightmare. July 21st, 1985. Glen Ellen, Illinois, a quiet suburban community in DuPage County, about 24 miles west of downtown Chicago. This was the kind of place where parents felt safe letting their teenagers walk to the store alone, where the biggest community concern was usually the upcoming high school football season. 15-year-old Christy Wesselman embodied everything parents hoped their children would become. She had been her freshman class president, was currently serving as her sophomore class vice president, and was an active athlete beloved by everyone who knew her. Teachers described her as responsible, kind, and mature beyond her years. On that summer afternoon, Christy did something completely ordinary, something thousands of teenagers across America do every single day. She walked to the local grocery store to buy a soda and a chocolate bar. It was a short trip, maybe 15 minutes round trip. Her mother expected her home soon, but Christy Wesselman would never make it home. When concern turned to panic, Glen Ellen police launched an immediate search. Officer after officer retraced the route Christy would have taken, checking every possible shortcut, every place a teenager might stop or detour. Then, in a field of tall grass near her planned route, they made a horrifying discovery. Christy had been brutally murdered, 8 stab wounds, and clear evidence of sexual assault told the story of her final, terrifying moments. But here's what made this crime scene different from a random act of violence. Investigators noticed that Christy's pearl ring was missing. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. The missing ring suggested something far more sinister, trophy-taking behavior, a psychological signature of serial sexual predators who take personal items to relive their crimes and maintain psychological power over their victims. At the crime scene, investigators collected what should have been the golden key to solving this case: biological evidence from the perpetrator, carefully preserved in a sexual assault kit. They had the killer's DNA, his unique genetic fingerprint, sitting right there in the evidence room. But here's where our story takes its first devastating turn, and where we need to understand the state of forensic science in 1985. In 1985, the most advanced DNA analysis method was called RFLP, restriction fragment length polymorphism. Now, that sounds incredibly sophisticated, right? Like something out of a science fiction movie. But RFLP had a critical, case-breaking flaw. It required massive amounts of high-quality, completely undegraded DNA, specifically 10 to 25 nanograms of pristine genetic material. To put that in perspective, that's like needing a biological sample the size of a quarter when all you have is a few microscopic cells. The biological evidence from Christy's body? It was microscopic and degraded by exposure to the elements. Completely useless for 1985 technology. Can you imagine the absolute frustration? Investigators had the killer's genetic blueprint sitting right there in the lab, but it might as well have been written in a language that wouldn't be invented for another decade. Without scientific leads, the investigation did what investigations always do. It started looking for suspects. And when you're operating in a complete evidence vacuum, that search can become incredibly dangerous for innocent people. This is where Dana Henry enters our story, and his experience should serve as a warning about what happens when justice systems operate without scientific certainty. Dana Henry was an unemployed laborer whose only crime was living 100 yards from where Christie's body was found. Think about that, 100 yards. In a small community like Glen Ellen, that made him a person of interest. In 1988, 3 years after the murder, investigators decided that proximity equaled suspicion. When they demanded Henry provide blood and saliva samples for this new, intimidating thing called DNA testing, he refused. And honestly, can you blame him? This was 1988. DNA testing was science fiction to most people. The average person had no idea what it was, how it worked, or why police would want their genetic material. But to investigators, his refusal looked like consciousness of guilt. What happened next reads like a cautionary tale about civil liberties and the presumption of innocence. Authorities subpoenaed Henry. When he continued to resist what seemed like an invasive and mysterious procedure, they threw him in jail for contempt of court. In his own words, Henry was stripped of his clothes and held in a cell until he finally complied with their demands. The psychological impact was devastating and immediate. When the DNA test results came back, they cleared him completely. No match, not even close. Dana Henry had absolutely nothing to do with Christy Wesselman's murder. But the damage was already done, and it was catastrophic. Henry spent $50,000 in legal fees, enough money to lose his house. He lost friendships, strained family relationships, and suffered psychological devastation that would last for decades. Years later, he would say, "I've been a whole another guy since. I don't like Dana Henry anymore." Think about that statement. An innocent man's life was destroyed not by the killer, but by the investigation trying to catch the killer. This is what happens when technology can't keep pace with the demands of justice, and when systems operate on suspicion rather than evidence. While Dana Henry was rebuilding his shattered life, a revolution was quietly transforming the entire world of forensic science. And here's the ironic twist that makes this case so remarkable. The breakthrough had actually been discovered in 1983, the exact same year our real killer was released from prison. A scientist named Kary Mullis had discovered something called the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. This discovery was so revolutionary that it would eventually win him the Nobel Prize in 1993. PCR was like a molecular photocopying machine. It could take a single molecule of DNA and make millions or billions of identical copies. Suddenly, that microscopic, degraded sample from Christie's body wasn't useless anymore. It was a goldmine of information waiting to be unlocked. But PCR was just the beginning. By the 1990s, scientists had developed an even better system called short tandem repeat analysis, or STR. Here's where STR was revolutionary compared to the old RFLP method. Instead of needing huge samples of perfect DNA, STR could examine specific short sections of DNA that repeat in patterns unique to each individual. It was like switching from needing an entire book to just needing to count specific repeated words. Far more efficient and requiring much smaller samples. STR could work with just a few skin cells, was faster, more reliable, and absolutely perfect for old, degraded evidence. But having the technology to read DNA wasn't enough. Law enforcement needed a way to connect that DNA to actual people. That's where CODIS comes in, the Combined DNA Index System. CODIS was authorized by Congress in 1994 and went online nationally in October 1998. It was designed to be a massive database of DNA profiles from crime scenes and convicted offenders. allowing automatic searches and matches across jurisdictions and decades. This was the missing piece of the puzzle, a system that could take a DNA profile from a 1985 murder and instantly compare it against millions of other profiles, looking for an exact match. In 2000, 15 years after Christie's murder, scientists finally had the tools they needed. They extracted DNA from the evidence in her case using the new STR technology and generated a complete genetic profile of her killer. They uploaded that profile to Cody's and waited for the system to work its magic, searching through hundreds of thousands of profiles looking for a match. The search came back empty. No match found. But why? The technology was finally ready. The database was operational. The DNA profile was clear and complete. So what was missing? To understand why Cody's found no match in 2000, we need to travel back in time to 1977, 8 years before Christie was even murdered. That's when Michael Jones, a violent sexual predator, was convicted of sexually assaulting a woman at gunpoint. The crime was brutal, calculated, and showed clear signs of the predatory behavior that would eventually escalate to murder. Jones was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. Justice served, right? The system worked, a dangerous predator was off the streets, and society was protected. Except it wasn't. Here's where our justice system failed in the most catastrophic way possible, and why understanding the 1970s to 1980s parole system is crucial to this story. During this era, America used what was called indeterminate sentencing, a system that gave enormous power to parole boards to determine when prisoners should be released, often based on subjective assessments of rehabilitation rather than public safety or the severity of the original crime. The theory was that prisoners could be cured of their criminal tendencies through rehabilitation programs, counseling, and good behavior in prison. It sounded progressive and humane, but in practice, it became a catastrophic failure that prioritized prison capacity over public safety. In 1983, after serving only 6 to 7 years of his 10 to 20-year sentence, Michael Jones was deemed rehabilitated by a parole board and released back into society. 2 years later, he murdered Christy Wesselman. This wasn't an isolated mistake. According to Bureau of Justice Statistics data on prisoners released in 1983, 59.6% of violent offenders were rearrested within 3 years. Think about that. Nearly 6 out of every 10 violent criminals released in 1983 were back in the system within 36 months. This wasn't rehabilitation. This was a revolving door that put public safety at risk while creating the illusion of justice. A geographic wild card. Here's another crucial detail that explains why Jones evaded detection for so long. He lived 150 miles away from Glen Ellen in Champaign, Illinois. This geographic distance placed him completely outside the initial investigation's focus, which naturally concentrated on local suspects and known offenders in the immediate area. Jones wasn't just hiding in plain sight. He was hiding in an entirely different community, making him essentially invisible to investigators who had no reason to look 150 miles away for their suspect. The perfect storm of failure. So when Cody's searched for Christie's killer in 2000, Michael Jones wasn't in the database. He had been convicted before DNA collection laws existed, and he had successfully avoided another serious conviction for 17 years after his release, long enough to slip through the cracks of every system designed to catch him. The billion-dollar investment in forensic technology and DNA databases was rendered completely useless by a parole decision made in 1983 and the geographic distance that kept Jones off investigators' radar. Can you imagine the cruel irony? The science was ready. The database was operational. The technology existed to solve this case instantly. But the one person they needed to find was protected by the very system that had failed to protect his future victims. Meanwhile, Jones continued living as a free man 150 miles away, while the Wesselman family lived with 15 years of unanswered questions and Dana Henry lived with the permanent scars of being falsely accused. Act 5. The Convergence, 1530 to 1800 hours. A law born from grief. The breakthrough in Christie's case began with a piece of legislation that was directly inspired by her murder, creating a perfect circle of justice that took decades to complete. In 2002, Illinois passed a comprehensive law requiring DNA samples from anyone convicted of any felony offense, not just violent crimes, but any felony. The law was championed by DuPage County State's Attorney Joe Burkett, the same prosecutor whose jurisdiction included Christie's still unsolved murder. Think about the poetic justice in that. A law inspired by Christie's case would eventually become the instrument of justice in her own case. But this law would need to wait 13 years for its moment to shine, until Michael Jones made one crucial mistake. That moment came in 2015, when a 62-year-old Michael Jones was arrested for domestic battery in Champaign, Illinois, 150 miles from where he had murdered Christie 30 years earlier. It was a relatively minor charge, the kind of case that might have resulted in probation or a small fine in earlier decades. But because of the 2002 law inspired by Christie's case, police were required to collect Jones's DNA. That sample was processed, profiled, and uploaded to Cody's. The system's automated search algorithm went to work, comparing Jones's genetic profile against the DNA profile that had been waiting in the database since 2000, including the unknown male profile from Christie Wesselman's 1985 murder. And then it happened. After 30 years of silence, Cody's flagged an exact match between Michael Jones and the unknown male profile from Christie Wesselman's 1985 murder. The DNA match revealed Michael Jones to be exactly the type of predator that criminal profilers would expect, but someone who had never been on investigators' radar for Christie's case. His geographic distance from Glen Ellen had placed him outside the initial investigation's focus. But when police began investigating his background, a terrifying picture emerged. An ex-girlfriend revealed crucial details about his behavior and lifestyle. Jones took long, solo motorcycle trips throughout the Midwest, giving him the mobility and anonymity to commit crimes far from his home base. He frequently traveled through the Glen Ellen area to visit family in Chicago, placing him near the crime scene at various times throughout the 1980s. Perhaps most chilling, she described his obsession with detective books and true crime shows, as if he viewed criminal investigation as an intellectual game where he was both player and opponent. For 3 decades, he had been hiding in plain sight, just another middle-aged man living a seemingly ordinary life while carrying the secret of a brutal murder. During questioning, prosecutors discovered something that revealed the burden of guilt Jones had carried for decades. A styrofoam cup on which he had written, "I'm sorry for 1985. A cryptic confession that would later become evidence of his psychological torment over the crime. Faced with irrefutable DNA evidence and his own written confession, Michael Jones had no choice but to accept reality. In 2018, at age 64, he pleaded guilty to murder and sexual assault charges, receiving an 80-year sentence that was effectively a life term. The sentencing hearing was dominated by Christie's mother, Sandra Wesselman. After 33 years of waiting for answers, she finally had the opportunity to confront her daughter's killer. In an 11-minute victim impact statement that brought the courtroom to tears, she described her daughter's unrealized potential with words that would echo far beyond that day. What she would have become will forever be an unfinished book. All the chapters that would never be written. All the dreams that would never be fulfilled. All the lives she would never touch. But more importantly, Sandra Wesselman issued a direct indictment of the system that had failed her family. Had he served at least the 10 years, we wouldn't be here today for this. Her words transformed a moment of personal grief into a public validation of the systemic failure that had enabled her daughter's murder. The conclusion of the legal case revealed something troubling about what we call justice. For the Wesselman family, Sandra expressed complex emotions. It's a joyful day and a very sad day. I can go home today and try to be a real person, whatever that is. But there was another person in that courtroom whose story reveals the incomplete nature of our justice system. Dana Henry, the innocent man whose life was destroyed in 1988, attended Jones's sentencing hoping for some form of closure or acknowledgement. He reiterated that the false accusation had ruined his life and, crucially, that he had never received an apology from police or any other authorities for the ordeal they had put him through. Think about that disparity. The system that successfully marshaled decades of scientific and legal evolution to convict a murderer had no corresponding mechanism to acknowledge, apologize for, or remedy the harm it had inflicted on an innocent man. Yet from tragedy came positive change. Christie's classmates, inspired by her memory, re-established a scholarship in her honor, ensuring that her name would be associated with educational achievement and community service rather than just the circumstances of her death. More importantly, the case led to significant reforms in criminal justice procedures, including the implementation of videotaped interrogations and enhanced protocols for handling DNA evidence, changes that would protect future suspects and strengthen future prosecutions. The indeterminate sentencing system that enabled Jones's early release was gradually replaced with truth in sentencing laws and determinate sentencing guidelines that prioritized public safety over subjective assessments of rehabilitation. The Christy Wesselman case teaches us that forensic science is both our greatest tool and our greatest limitation. When DNA analysis couldn't be performed in 1985, it created an investigative vacuum that was filled with suspicion, false accusations, and the destruction of innocent lives. But when technology finally caught up, it delivered incontrovertible justice across 3 decades, connecting evidence from 1985 to a criminal arrested in 2015. The question we must ask ourselves is this: how many other cases are sitting cold in evidence rooms across America, waiting for the next technological breakthrough? How many families are still waiting for answers that current science cannot provide, but future science will unlock? And perhaps more importantly, how many Dana Henrys are out there, innocent people whose lives were destroyed by investigations that operated on suspicion rather than evidence? Michael Jones's early release in 1983 wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a symptom of a system that prioritized prison capacity over public safety, rehabilitation theory over victim protection. The cost of that decision cannot be measured merely in Christy Wesselman's lost life. It must also include 33 years of grief for her family, the destruction of Dana Henry's life, and the countless hours and resources spent on a case that should have been solved decades earlier. Today, Michael Jones will spend the rest of his life in prison. The Wesselman family finally has answers after 33 years of waiting. But somewhere, Dana Henry is living with permanent scars from being falsely accused, and thousands of other cold cases remain unsolved, waiting for their own moment when science, law, and chance finally align. The murder of Christy Wesselman was solved not through brilliant detective work or a moment of inspiration, but through the slow, patient convergence of science, law, and pure chance over more than 3 decades. It's a testament to human persistence and technological progress, but also a stark reminder of how systemic failures can enable the very crimes we're trying to prevent. The question isn't whether justice was served in the Christy Wesselman case. The question is whether we've learned enough from this 33-year journey to prevent the next Christy Wesselman, to protect the next Dana Henry, and to ensure that when technology and justice finally converge, they do so in a way that truly serves all victims or not just some. What do you think? Have we learned enough from cases like this to prevent future tragedies? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the cases that changed criminal justice forever.